So the United Pentecostal Church taught that the end times were coming soon, that the end of the world was coming any minute, that the signs were there, that Jesus was going to come and take his followers away in a rapture, and there would be times of tribulation, etc., etc. Now, I realize there is some variation from Christian church to Christian church on this topic. In fact, there's a lot of variation, but all I can tell you is what I was taught and what kind of impact it had on me. Since I wasn't raised Pentecostal or fundamentalist, I really didn't know much about these sort of end times doctrines or anything, and when I started hearing about it at the church, it was pretty new to me. One of the first sermons about this that really stood out in my mind, and I think I heard this one right before I went away to college, and I started hearing about it more when I got into college, was the idea of taking the mark of the beast, the idea that a mark would have to be put on you in order to buy or sell. And I remember the pastor brought in a news article about how they had the technology to implant chips into pets and people in order to track them and make sure they weren't lost. And I remember how passionately he preached against taking a chip like this. And he said, you know, not that taking that particular chip would be the mark of the beast so much, because there wasn't anything that said, you know, if you take this mark, you are serving me. But the pastor claimed this was coming at any time, and if we are ever required to take a chip like this, we should refuse. We should, you know, pretty much die before taking a chip like that. And I remember thinking, wow, I didn't know all this stuff was in the Bible. I didn't know about the mark of the beast and the Antichrist, and how the Antichrist would have a religious leader with him, and how, you know, there's going to be all these signs and trumpets and seals and all these different things in Revelation, and how, you know, Jesus was going to come back and there was going to be a huge war, and all this was completely new to me, and it sort of freaked me out. I remember learning about the rapture and the idea that, you know, two people would be working in a field and one would be taken up and one would be left. So basically the idea that, you know, all of a sudden a huge group of people, or however many people, would just go missing, and God would just take them away. And I remember that feeling of like, oh, wouldn't it be awful if you realize that you missed the rapture? And this was something that was talked about in sermons a lot. You know, that feeling of, you know, showing up at church and noticing a huge chunk of people missing, and realizing, you know, I missed the rapture, and realizing there was this huge group of people that suddenly went missing, and how awful that would feel, and how you had to make sure you were right with God so this wouldn't happen to you, and how the world was going to go through this time of, you know, wars and horrible things and creepy scorpions and all kinds of horrible things. It was a quite frightful mental picture, thinking of Armageddon and the Battle of Armageddon and all that. There was never a time and date given of when, you know, the rapture was going to occur, and there was never a specific Antichrist nailed down. But definitely the whole idea that the United Nations work together, and the idea that certain political leaders were pushing certain agendas, especially agendas that were trying to get us all to work as a world government, supposedly. That kind of, any leader with that kind of mentality was usually, you know, a possible Antichrist. And any natural disaster that happened, any major thing, it was like, oh, it's because we're living in the last days. I mean, that was a very common statement with people I went to church with. You know, if a horrible, tragic accident happened, if there was a school shooting, if there was an earthquake, if there was a hurricane, it'd be like, truly, these must be the end days. That was a really common thing to say, actually, when you thinking back, that's a little weird. Even with all this feeling of, there's all this information and all these signs, there were even people that took it even a little further than what was preached over the pulpit. I know there were United Pentecostals, I believe his brother Baxter was the name. I remember there was this End Times magazine in both the churches I went to regularly that you could pick up at the back. Usually they both had a subscription to it, and the big pile would be in the back, and I'd usually take one. And a lot of times it was like, watch for this sign and this sign and the seventh seal or the seventh trumpet and all this stuff. And those magazines went into more detail about, like, how some people believed that some of the signs, like the trumpets or the seals, I don't remember which one it was, had already occurred. Like Chernobyl was a sign because of some sort of, I don't remember. I remember reading about it and thinking it was a little far-fetched even then. I really look at the rapture as something that was used to scare people into not being lukewarm Christians. You know, the whole, what if you're not Christian enough? What if you're not Christian enough to make it up in the rapture? Then you'll be stuck here going through these horrible things, and maybe you'll go to heaven later, although we don't really know whether you will or not, but maybe you'll go to heaven later, but you'll have to go through these awful things and suffer these things. Wouldn't you rather live for God now? I mean, there's not very much time left. You just have to make it a little ways in your Christian walk. You just have to live as sinless as possible and repent, you know, if you ever do anything wrong, and make sure you follow God every moment. But there's not very much time left, so that should be pretty easy. It's a short period. So, you know, strive to be as good of a Christian as possible. Strive to give everything, because you don't want to give one little bit less than what you needed, do you? That was what preaching about the rapture was useful for. It was a tactic that made you feel like, wow, the Bible is so true, and yet made you afraid enough to make sure you clung to God. At least that's how it worked for me. And I always felt like I didn't want to be lukewarm anyway. So as much as it interested me, this wasn't my very favorite subject, and it wasn't something that I loved to hear about, because I figured I don't need to be guilted and feared into serving God. Whenever we had services about that, I tried to make sure I was on track, and if I felt I was, I made sure I prayed for those who weren't.